My name is Brother Thomas. I'm happy that so many came to this 8th annual Franciscan lecture. And we wanted to make a note of thanks to the Franciscan brothers at Brooklyn who provided a grant 8 years ago to start this kind of a program. And so we're still going strong. It's my privilege to ask you to join in an opening prayer, and then we'll just follow the program after that. The prayer is on the back page of the program. So I invite you all to say it along with me. The prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. And now I welcome to the podium our provost, Dr. Houlihan.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. This, along with having the brothers here on a daily basis, this event every year is one of my favorite things the brothers give to us. My colleague, fellow Vice President Linda Werbel-Deshevsky, is going to do the introduction of Father Andre, who has visited us a number of times. I've always had mixed feelings about Father Andre. I'm sorry. I went on the pilgrimage in 2001. I had an absolutely terrific time. It was incredibly moving, and yet any time I speak to any other pilgrim who's come back and they say, "Oh, did you have Father Andre?" and I say, "No, he wasn't there that year," they shake their heads in pity. And I try to explain, really, it is a moving place without him. But he is a wonderful man, and we're very happy to have you and very lucky to have you here today. So special thanks to the brothers for their support of this event for the last 8 years, and in particular to campus ministry, Brother Thomas Grady, and his better half who joins us here today. She tried to retire, but Sister Colleen is sitting in the middle. So now I welcome Vice President Linda Werbel-Deshevsky, Vice President for Government and Community Relations.
It's my good luck and my good fortune that I get to introduce Father Andre, and I can't believe that it's only been over a year that I've known Father Andre, and being able to greet him is like greeting a relative that you really like and you're really excited to see. And so today I get the opportunity to publicly thank Father Andre for the experience that he gave to me personally and the other pilgrims that I traveled with, Sue, Carl, and Chris. And just to think about it, Father Andre's been doing these pilgrimages for many years. It says in the program, you can read the bio. And then on each pilgrimage, there's about 30 or 40 pilgrims on the trip. And if you just think about the magnitude of the amount of lives that he's touched so deeply, because I know for me personally, the inspiration that he's given me, and something that I turn to quite frequently during the year. Again, I'm not reading the bio. You can see that he's a scholar. He holds multiple graduate degrees. He's published many books. Many of you most recently attended the lecture he gave here at the college about the 3 heroes of Assisi. His scholarship is very impressive, but that's not what makes Andre special. What makes Andre special is the way he delivers his speeches, his talks, his sermons, with his passion and candor and courage. I don't think any of us will ever forget the lecture that he delivered about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the way to get closer to God is by doing good. Andre is notable for his energy. As we all know, anyone who participated in the pilgrimage, you'd be walking all day and we'd be pretty tired, and then had to sit down for a lecture, and he would deliver lectures on the highest of level with multiple sources, and no matter how tired we were, we couldn't get enough of his words. And I also think another characteristic that we have to talk about when we talk about Father Andre is his courage. He has the courage to speak critically about the church. He displays tremendous respect for women and their role in the church by making sure that Clare was really represented in the pilgrimage, and I think, and in his writings. I love watching Andre being greeted by the nuns around Assisi, and not only by the nuns, by the taxi drivers too. Andre is a man of the world. He's led pilgrimages all over Prague, England, Mallorca, France, Germany, California. Last spring he was in Australia. And wherever he goes, he shares his love of Franciscanism and humanity and, of course, fun. I do believe that the fun part is a crucial part to knowing Andre. Many of us are probably beginning to feel tired. It's 4 o'clock after a long week with many events. And it's the perfect time for Brother Andre to inspire with us and share his energy with us as he talks about Fraternitas. So, friends, let me introduce Father Andre Cirino.
When Tom Grady called me to do this talk this afternoon, and we were discussing the topic, and I chose, I landed on the word fraternitas, and I'd like to, well, all right. Thank you. I'd like to begin with a little incident that Tom was a part of, and because Tom's a part of our Franciscan history for the Third Order Regula, you hosted a meeting of the committee that was writing the Third Order Regula rule, didn't you? You were the general minister at the time, I think, or the leader, weren't you? Oh, well, prior to being in the hot seat, you were he was hosting scholars from around the world, I think on Long Island. You put them out there, and they were doing a very difficult task of rewriting the Third Order Regula rule that was kind of filtering back to St. Francis, but they needed to have it in a new articulation. And Tom hosted this international group of people from around the world, with the great Margaret Carney in the group, if I remember correctly, and Jean-Francois. And there was a struggle at that meeting. I didn't get this from Tom, but I got it from Margaret Carney, that when they came to speaking about the word fraternitas in this official document that deals with St. Francis, the issue was putting it in English created a big problem for the writers because of the fact that if they translate fraternitas with fraternity, okay, it's akin to what we have on our university campuses and colleges. You've got fraternities and sororities. And they felt that it was a huge problem there to use that word, fraternity. And they were struggling with it, but ultimately opted to stay with the word in English, fraternity. And the reason why I didn't use it in English as a title, because the Latin word is feminine. Those of you who know languages, the Latin word fraternitas is feminine. So for our male and female members of the Third Order Regular, the word fraternity and its meanings that we're going to look at this afternoon would carry over better if we use the word fraternitas. So I want to say that at the beginning. And I'd like to also say at the beginning that the word fraternity is always challenged by the word community. And the word community is never in the writings of St. Francis. He never uses it. So for us, especially Franciscans, to use the word community is not working within the ambit of St. Francis's writings. And that's why fraternitas and its meaning that Francis gives it is very significant for us and for a lot of other ramifications that I hope you will be able to pick up this afternoon. So I'd like to give you a little bit of historical backdrop, if I could, to this whole notion of fraternitas. And I'd like to begin talking about a little bit about the political situation in Assisi when Francis is about 16 years old, at age 16, around 1198, if you will, there was a huge revolt in the city of Assisi. Do you remember the Rocca Maggiore? Those of you who've been there, you do? Did you climb up to it? You know what I mean. Well, the leader of the city was living in the Rocca Maggiore in 1198. And he left that castle and he was the representative of the emperor in Northern Europe. And he left the castle to travel south to Spoleto to surrender Assisi to the Pope and the papal troops. Okay? But the people in Assisi did not want to come under papal domination. Isn't that interesting? They didn't want to come under papal domination. So to try to explain a little bit more what was going on politically, I want to speak about the political system that they were living under. I don't know if I'm using the exact terminology. You who teach history, you would know this better than me. But we live in this democracy here in the United States. They lived under feudalism. And feudalism was divided into a couple of sections. You had the mayores and the minores. People were divided into these two groups. I don't want to say majors and minors, it's too much like baseball, but it's what it translates down to. You've got the mayores and the minores. And the mayores would have been the people who were the counts, the dukes, the marquises, the knights, all the people of nobility, if you will. And the people on the minores side were also divided into two more groups. We had the middle class. It was just emerging at that time. And we had the serfs. The middle class had a lot of money. And when they got enough money to be able to somehow get a knight into the family, they would transfer into the mayores, the upper class of Assisi, or of the commune at that time. And everybody who lived here, everybody who lived in this setup, had to swear allegiance to a liege lord. So that would be somebody of a noble family, and Claire's family was noble, and they had 8 knights in that family. So you would swear allegiance to one of them, or to a bishop. The bishops were liege lords at that time. And some of them were not the kindest type of liege lords you would want to live under. Now the serfs were no more than slaves, if you will. Their freedom was very much curtailed. The middle class, the church didn't know how to deal with. And in the research of one of our friars by the name of Robert Stewart, he died very young of cancer, but a great scholar. He wrote a thesis on the secular Franciscan branch of our order. And in studying their rule, and he was looking at the middle class, he discovered that the church in the 13th century didn't know how to deal with them and basically considered them a group to be condemned or damned. And that's where Francis lived, in this group. He lived in the middle class, if you will. His father had quite a bit of money. Now, feudalism was quite strong, and you had, if I can also divide it further, you had feudalism would have been imperial, and it would have been papal. And that doesn't mean the mayores and minores are under the whole thing. But this would be like the Republicans and the Democrats in a democracy, if you're following what we're talking about here. And basically, relationships here were vertical or hierarchical. Someone was always in charge of you. They were over you. And this was the form of government that was in existence when Francis was born and when he is blossoming into a whole new world, as well as Claire. Concomitant with this there was a new form of government making its way into the so-called Italian city-states. And it was called a government of the people. Or it was called, in Italian, they use the expression comune, usually spelled with one M. The comune. A new form of government was asserting itself at that time in opposition to feudalism. And the forces were so strong, and if you know the life of St. Francis, the forces were so strong that in 1202, he was about 20 or 21. In 1202, the mayores, okay, fought this group of people, the people of the comune, and Francis goes off to war against a papal city, which was Perugia at that time. He goes off to war to fight for the minores, and or more the comune, if you will. And the mayores, Clare's family, had fled to Perugia to live under papal domination, if you will, at that time. And when Francis goes to fight in that war in 1202, he's captured, and he becomes a POW for a year. Now, just to give you a flavor of the idea that feudalism by 1203 had been weakened in Assisi. It had been weakened in Assisi. And by 1210, feudalism on paper was demolished, if you will, eliminated. And the government of the comune begins to take root. Do you remember the name of the piazza, the main piazza in Assisi? Piazza, what, Linda? Comune. Piazza, Government Square. The real name is Piazza Vittorio Emanuele, but nobody calls it that. They call it Piazza Comune, the government square. Okay, going back to the time of this revolution, when by 1210, feudalism is officially out of office, if you could. Oh, one thing I forgot to put down here. The reason why there was the most conflict between the two groups is this group was taxable, and this group was not taxable. Hello? Hello? Maybe I don't know, the Republicans? You can throw me out for that, but I really don't care. But that's an important item. You can see how it's going to create terrific conflict, and the people carrying the tax base are the middle class. They're the tax base at that time, and these people scot-free. So the conflict was quite strong. The social atmosphere of the comune in which Francis had grown up encouraged him to prefer to seek out groups whose members were on an equal footing. And he himself belonged to and was elected leader of a club, in quotation marks, a group of young men who used to meet for banquets or other types of entertainment. That's when he was footloose and fancy-free. And he had all the money to do whatever he wanted to do. But he shared that in a group of equals. In a group of equals. So from his earliest days, he was hanging out with people in a horizontal relationship. Just like to share a quote with you from a book by William Manchester. It's called A World Lit by Fire. And it's about the medieval mind and the Renaissance. He writes, the most baffling, elusive, and in yet many ways the most significant dimensions of the medieval mind were invisible and silent. One was the medieval person's total lack of ego. Even those with the creative powers had no sense of self in that time, in the 13th century. For example, he writes, each of the great soaring medieval cathedrals, one of our most treasured legacies from that age, required 3 or 4 centuries to build. Canterbury was 23 generations in the making. Chartres was 18 generations in the making. Yet there's no names of architects or builders associated with either structure. They were simply glorifying God, and to them their identity in this life was irrelevant. Their anonymity, writes Manchester, approached the absolute. And he makes this statement: among the implications about this lack of selfhood was an almost total indifference to privacy. For example, he wrote, in the summertime, peasants went about naked. They couldn't go to Walmart to buy their clothes. They had to make them. So why wear them if you're going to wear them out when you don't need them? So they didn't use them. But there was a total indifference to nakedness, if you will. There's a whole thing you could do on a spirituality of nakedness, but I don't want to get into that right now. Go off the whole topic. Okay, but it's an interesting topic, the spirituality of nakedness. But there's also a book by a woman from, she was at Columbia University, Caroline Walker Bynum. And she has a book of 5 essays. The second essay, the title of it is, Did the 12th Century Discover the Individual? Manchester and Bynum are pointing out to us there was no sense of individuality in the 13th century. Francis grew up with that lack of sense. Today, and I've mentioned this in Assisi frequently, in an institution like this, you try to build a toilet without putting the donor's name on the door. I mean, we're so honed into the individual, and that's all since perhaps the advent of Freud in the last century and the whole world of psychology, which has introduced us to the person, the individuality of a person. But in the 13th century, there was no sense of that. Does that make sense to you? Am I losing you, or are you with me? We're together? Okay. This is just by way of backdrop to talk about how Francis would use the term fraternitas, if you will. We've had a periodical existing for about the last 20 years called Greyfriars Review, which is going to die this year. It's sad. We're going to lose it. But Greyfriars Review is a periodical that they would take the greatest scholarship from around the world and translate it all into English on Franciscanism. So we were able to delve into people's thoughts across the world. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts of a Capuchin Franciscan by the name of Julio Micó on Fraternitas in an article that was published in that same journal in, I don't have the year, sorry, which is volume 8. But he had some very, very interesting thoughts about Fraternitas and Francis. So I'd like to just do that for a few moments if I could. He writes, Francis's participation in the emergence of Assisi as a free commune of equal citizens familiarized him with horizontal relationships in contrast with those of the feudal system, which were hierarchical and vertical. I think we've already seen that very clearly. Francis had grown up and was naturally attracted to the egalitarian system, so that when he set out to follow the gospel way of life, he embodies it in a fraternitas. That is, in a group of equals. That's the first quality, a group of equals. Second quality, whose responsibility was reciprocal. Third quality, and in which everyone contributed to the search for the will of God. That was, according to Micó, the notion that Francis was carrying. The fraternity, the fraternitas, is based on the conviction, and this is written, of course, for the brothers, that we are all brothers because we are all equal in dignity, and because our relationship with each other are inspired by Christ, who is our brother. Or as Eric Doyle calls Jesus, he calls Jesus the first friar. Now, that's interesting. You use the term friar for yourselves or not? You don't use the term friar. Okay. The first brother. The first brother, Eric Doyle, refers to Jesus in that way. Now, the Trinity is the basis, the origin, and the model for fraternitas. Because created as we are in the image of the triune God, the brothers have been called to overcome their differences and to reproduce among them the loving relationships of the within the Trinity. So the first Franciscans, far from regarding themselves as an order gives us a technical type of legalization with the church. And we were not an order in the beginning. We were a movement. What happened with Francis was a movement going on in the church. There's a lot of movements going on, I know, in the Catholic Church still today. There's an older one from the 60s you might call the charismatic movement. There's a liturgical movement, if to name a couple of them. And there are movements of groups of people within the Catholic Church as well. So we were a movement in the beginning, not an order. And because they thought of themselves in the terms of fraternitas as equal, living the gospel life together. And in Francis's writings, it's interesting that when he spoke about the whole group of friars in fraternity, he would use an uppercase F. And when he spoke of the brothers' connection with one another, he used a lowercase f. So they had the distinction there. So he always used the term fraternity to mean the institution, but he used the word brother with all its implications of reciprocal love and service to indicate fraternal relationships between the friars. In Francis's eyes, writes Micot, fraternity did not consist in the individual brother's relationship with the community at large, but in relationships which the brothers had with each other, alter alterius, each brother to the other, so that Francis never spoke about a fraternity in the abstract, but only spoke about the brothers as individuals and with relationship to each other. Let me say something with the backdrop to that and maybe say a little bit more about it. Before Francis came on the scene at the beginning of the 13th century, there was only two forms of religious life that existed. One form was monasticism. So a man could become a monk in a monastery, a woman could become a nun in a monastery. Most of our sisters, and if there are sisters in the room here, they're not nuns, they are sisters because they don't live in a monastery. People who live in a monastery are usually locked away. So the monk or the nun were monastics living in a monastery. That was one form of religious life before Francis. A second form of religious life was what's called eremitism, that you were a hermit, off by yourself somewhere in the woods or in a cave, or living sometimes in a building adjacent to a church, attached to a church. So you could either be a monk or a hermit before Francis. When Francis comes on the scene and he begins having to deal with the leadership of the Catholic Church, they say to him, why don't you take on the rule of St. Benedict? Or why don't you take on the rule of St. Augustine? And Francis says, no, I'm a new kind of fool. Imagine telling that to Rome. I'm a new kind of fool, he said. And what he does, and he begins to talk about this, he says, I don't live in a monastic cloister. I'm not locked in by walls. My cloister is the world. And the brothers and sisters will live out in that cloister. You're beginning to see a little difference? Okay? It was a wider expanse for Francis. He, in the 13th century, you would never had the Franciscan Brothers of Brooklyn existing. Because you were founded primarily for education in the beginning, right? As educators. I don't know your history in detail, but the brothers came into existence for education purposes. Most religious communities come into existence after the 16th century, came into existence only for a specific purpose, like a hospital or a social agency or some institution that they worked with, okay? That's how religious life was. At Francis's time, that did not exist. Religious life was monks, nuns, or hermits. And Francis twists it and turns it completely upside down. And he turns it upside down because he knew what was going on in the monastery. when a person entered the monastery, if I entered a monastery and you're the whole community of the monastery, the only thing expected of me was to relate to all of you, to relate to you as a group. There was no expectation of me as a monk to relate one-to-one. First of all, they didn't have the concept of individuality. We spoke about that a little bit. And the other idea behind it was the notion of community was relate one to all. Now, we've had people come into religious life over the years, and some of them have related one to all, but when you talk about that person, you say, you know, she relates very well to everybody, or he relates very well to everybody, but nobody knows her. Nobody knows him, because they're not relating one to one. Okay? In Francis's time, the notion of fraternitas is that he wanted every member of his movement to relate one to one. Brother to brother, brother to sister, sister to sister. He wanted that individual relationship, and that was completely new in the 13th century. Am I making sense to you? You following? Okay. Because I don't know if you're in a state of pious coma out there or what's going on, but it's, as Linda said, the bad time of day. It's interesting that in relating one-to-one, we have a source from one of Francis's biographies, and they asked him once in kind of a conversation, could he describe to them what a good friar minor should look like? And Francis, you can see from his answer, he knew the brothers individually. And let me just read you some of the things he said. He said, a good friar minor should have the faith of Brother Bernard, the simplicity of Brother Leo, the courtesy of Brother Angelo, the gracious look, good sense, and natural eloquence of Brother Maceo. Maceo was tall, dark, and handsome. When he went to beg in the city, the housewives waited for him with big loaves of bread. When Francis went begging, he was short and puny, and they would just barely give him anything. Or the mind upraised to God of Brother Giles, the prayer of Brother Rufino, the patience of Brother Juniper, the courage of Brother John, charity of Brother Roger, and the caution of Brother Lucidus, who was unwilling to remain in a place longer than a month, for when he began to like a place, he would leave it at once, saying, my home is not here but in heaven. And his provincial could never find him. But Francis knew the brothers individually. And that's how he introduces, in the 13th century, the notion of connecting one to one. We take that totally for granted. We presume that today. But when you look back also, you look back at marriage in previous centuries, marriage was not built on a love relationship. It was arranged. It was arranged. If you ever think of, if you saw Fiddler on the Roof, when Tevye finds after his second daughter wants to get married because she loves him, he turns to Golda and says, do you love me? You know, my father and mother said we would learn to love each other when they set us up. But after 25 years, I'm asking, do you love me? The idea of individual relationship, Francis puts, if you will, into practice, and especially in the Franciscan order. Those are some of the thoughts of Julio Micó. One of the things I avoided this afternoon, because his greatest expression of fraternitas comes in his Canticle of the Creatures, his Canticle of Creation. If you study Italian literature, the first piece of literature that you study is the Canticle of the Creatures. And then you go to Dante, who's the end of the 13th century. But Francis's Canticle is, if you will, the first recognized piece of Italian literature. And for Francis, in that piece that he wrote for us, that Canticle, you can see his fraternitas extended to more than just persons. He is known for his love of nature to the point of being regarded as the first ecologist. I think it was 1978. that he was declared the patron saint of ecology. Francis, most people who know St. Francis, and if you've ever gone to Staten Island, I never used to go there as a child. I grew up a mile from here, Carl Street and 4th Avenue. That's where I grew up. And we never went to Staten Island because there was no bridge. You had to take a ferry in those years, if some of you might remember, to go to Staten Island. And now my family, part of them are out there, and I have to go there. So I don't care for it. But when you go to Staten Island, oh, sorry, I shouldn't absolve me. When you go to Staten Island, you just look around at the front lawns and see how many bird baths you see with Francis standing in the middle of them with animals all around him. Okay? He gets that kind of a skewed dimension put on him because of the Canticle of the Creatures. And there are multiple stories about Francis in dealing with nature in general and with animals or insects in particular. I just mentioned a couple of things to you. He used to delight in beholding the sun, the moon, if you will. He was very gentle with earthworms, and he would lift them off the paths lest they be crushed underfoot by the passerby. When I walk through Assisi, I go out for an early morning walk, I see the worms. I can't pick worms up. I just can't do it. But I'll take a little stick and pick them up with a stick. But I don't know, there's something slimy about it that I can't take. But anyway, also in winter, he had honey or good wine, imagine, good wine put out for bees so they wouldn't die of the cold. The beauty of flowers and their elegant shapes and fragrance filled him with joy. And when he came across a large field of flowers, he would preach to them. Now think about that. If you came across somebody standing at the edge of a field of sunflowers or poppies as they come out in Assisi every May and June, and just preaching to the poppies. He did that. You'd put somebody in some psychiatric institution for that today, but he did that. He preached to them, inviting them to praise God as if they were endowed with reason. He did the same with ripening grain fields and vineyards, rocks and trees, everything beautiful in the countryside, water from the springs, leafy orchards, and so forth. He called all creatures brother and sister, as if he had already achieved the glorious freedom of the children of God and was able to see into the heart of every creature. Just like to give you a quote from Eric Doyle. Eric Doyle was a friar minor in England, died in 1984 at about age 44, 45 from cancer. But he wrote a beautiful text on St. Francis and the Canticle of the Creatures. And in there, he talks about each of the creatures that Francis writes about, if you will, and does some ecological theology about it, spirituality, and some reflection. And he writes there is no vacuum between one person and the next, or between a human being and air, or between a flower and a child. The contemplative person loves creatures as they are. And then he writes, as a creature, water is our sister, and it's hardly normal to pour toxic acid into your sister. It is, moreover, completely abnormal and utterly immoral to assemble parts of creation, creatures like ourselves, and hurl them back at creation in the form of deadly bullets and lethal bombs. Are you getting him? Hello? He said, if we really saw water as our sister, would we pour toxic agents into our sister? Well, think about how you clean your toilets at home. What chemicals do we use? How do we poison the system? You know? I was in some cities, I remember exercising, and as I passed a sewer, there was a sign on it, don't pour oil down into me. They didn't want oil from cars being poured into sewers because it goes into the ecosystem. And Eric Doyle is talking about how we have treated I'm sure you've done many studies of that on your own. But he continues, he says, in its tiniest detail, creation spoke a word to Francis. And that's evidently the reason why he said we should be obedient to all of creation. Francis responded to the words spoken to him by creatures with love and reverence. Everything he endowed with a value and a dignity peculiarly its own, which forbade him even to think of dominating anything, because that would have been to enslave it. A theologian came at the end of the 13th century by the name of John Duns Scotus. I know you know his name. A bunch of you probably do. John Duns Scotus, by the way, whose teachings were rejected for centuries by the Catholic Church. For example, his teaching on the Immaculate Conception was not accepted by the Catholic Church. He was forbidden even to use it. Thomas Aquinas denied the Immaculate Conception. That was one of Scotus's basic teachings in reference to teaching about the primacy of Jesus Christ. And Scotus, in one of his other teachings, very beautifully talking about the human person, and talking about all of creation, but specifically the human person, he says, everyone has what he called in Latin haeceitas or haeseity. Everyone has their own unique person, or if you will, I'm using person, their own uniqueness. Every creation, there is no one person like another. Yes, there are men and women. We have similarities that way, but no one person is like the other. And when he speaks of this haeceitas, if you will, this uniqueness of the human person, I think he's coming out of a basis of fraternitas, where Francis pulls us to relate so intimately to one to the other. The way he related even to a flower or to a worm. And you come out of the Portiuncula, there's a beautiful bronze statue of Francis, and on his finger he has a cricket. I don't know if bronze statues go for $100,000. I don't know if I'd pay $100,000 for a cricket. But somebody thought well enough to make that statue. And they have him standing against the wall, kind of leaning against the wall, looking at the cricket, if you will, just walking on his finger. The idea of relating one to one. St. Francis, the implications for creation, the implications for ecology, implications for, I think, the way we study psychology. If Scotus is speaking of this uniqueness of the human person, he goes to make the statement that each human being is its own ultimate solitude before God. Each human being, its ultimate solitude before God. Let me conclude with some few statements. If there's any questions, we'll share. I think that Francis's notion of fraternitas offers a challenge to the whole Franciscan family. And I think it offers a challenge to this institution, this college here, with its own Franciscan flavor. Father Damien Isabel says the first form of evangelization is living in fraternitas with one another. That's a poor servant life, or a witness life, if you will. Living in fraternitas. And another statement from other documentation, and speaking of formation, I'd like to maybe use the word education or formation, is a theological way of thinking of the work that's happening here, okay? And if we look at the work happening here from the concept of fraternitas, of dealing with the individual, specifically, unique person, if you will, then one of the other persons mentioned here says that fraternitas becomes the privileged place to recognize and encounter God. Fraternitas becomes the privileged place for recognizing and encountering God. Fraternal communion is a God-enlightened space. Think of this as a God-enlightened space in which to experience God's hidden presence. Building fraternitas presupposes a sincere listening to to the call of God, which removes us from our securities and our places, and places us rather in a process of daring with clarity and audacity. It knocks us out of our security and puts us in a position of daring with clarity and audacity, writes another person. Often marked by interpersonal conflicts, Fraternitas appears precisely as the privileged place also for being merciful. Being merciful, when you take the etymological derivation of that word, it comes down from the female womb, which is nurturing and nourishing. So if our interpersonal experiences can become an experience of mercy, if you will. And lastly, this other quote from one other writer, the most efficient evangelization consists of living fraternitas, as Francis envisioned it. So those are just some basic notions of it. I don't know if any of you went to Revolt. Did we? We never went there, did we? It's one of the more remote sanctuaries. It's down in the valley. You know, when we go down to Porziuncola, it's about 2 miles away from south of the Porziuncola. Revolt, when we take a group there, which is rare, but when we do go there, that's the first place of where the brothers began to live together in fraternitas there. They lived in a shack. There was an abandoned shack, and they were living in the shack. And one day, the story goes that a farmer returned with his donkey and threw the brothers out. And of course, they left. But then they headed towards Porziuncola, which you know also very well. But the idea that fraternitas, the relationships that they began to build in that very primitive hovel at Revolt became the basis of the entire Franciscan order today. It's an order of fraternitas. It's an order that recognizes the little person, the individual person, the person in his or her uniqueness, if you will. And the same with all of creation. Anything we're trying to do with creation today can find its basis in Francis's concept of fraternitas. So I'm going to stop with that. If there are any comments or questions, I'd be happy to share with you. I don't know if it made sense. I think that's the value of trying to walk in fraternitas. I think our Franciscan institutions, I just finished 2 leadership pilgrimages with health institutions and educational institutions. And I think if our institutions take that approach to people especially, and let alone to take that approach to all of creation, okay, it would have a different effect in our institutions. And that's why we're bringing leaders, as many of you have come to Assisi with us, to pick up on some of Francis's thought in that regard, and to feel it's not just it is a good human thing to do with people. It's more than that. It's more than that. It comes to us out of the Hebrew scriptures. It comes to us out of the Christian scriptures. It comes to us as value to begin to walk with. I thank you for that. If Scotus his work on the uniqueness of the individual, that whole thing is almost a beautiful masterpiece about what you're saying. First, the thing that would be most unique is for Francis to teach the brothers the one-on-one stuff. We take it for granted. We lived that day in and day out. That's not the way they lived. They lived vertically. They lived in this type of a hierarchical situation. So first of all, Francis just getting it across to the brothers was one idea. And if the brothers, and us brothers today, and our sisters today, okay, if our brothers and sisters today, if we live fraternitas, then it has a different effect on what we do for ministry. And people know it because people can relate to you. And it's all built on relationship, and it's all ultimately rooted in the relationships of the Trinity. Chronologically, Aquinas and Bonaventure dropped dead in 1274. They're gone in 1274. Scotus is 9 years old. Okay, so he's just coming into life. By the end of the 13th century, he's already teaching at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne by that point. And Scotus begins one of his earliest doctrines to talk about the primacy of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the most important aspect of all creation. He's speaking of that. And he said, Scotus taught that if we speak of Jesus from the scriptures as the primacy of all creation, and this is the highest good that comes to us from God, you cannot say that the highest good comes to us from God in a vessel of sin. Consequently, the person who conceived him had to be free of sin. So he begins to speak of Mary in that way. Immaculate. She was immaculately conceived. So she was not tainted with any sin. So if you will, Tom just showed me the beautiful tabernacle in your chapel here. You know, I love woodwork, and just seeing that today was beautiful. And the tabernacle contains the preciousness of the presence of Jesus Christ. And Mary in her body becomes the first tabernacle of the Most High God. So Scotus is saying you can't say that tabernacle was a vessel of sin. The Catholic Church did not accept that. Thomas had already negated it. Bonaventure was confused on it. He doesn't give a clear statement. And from the 13th century all the way to the 19th century, it was forbidden to speak about it. When Juniper Serra goes to California to set up what we call today the missions, and he establishes a mission in Lompoc, and he wants to name it for Mary in the 18th century, he cannot call it the Immaculata Concepcion. He calls it La Purissima. He gets the same idea, but doesn't use the title that the church would condemn, if you will. But then in 1854, I think it's Pius IX declares this to be a dogma of the Catholic Church. You have to believe that Mary was immaculately conceived. And 2 years later, the little girl in Lourdes has a vision of a woman and asks her, "What's your name?" And she says, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And that was a Bernadette Lourdes thing. So the idea of Scotus pushing the Immaculate Conception was an early piece, but based on the primacy of Jesus Christ. Not just trying to make Mary into a deity. That's not what Scotus is doing. What Scotus is trying to do is say, as tabernacle of the Most High God, and this tabernacle Tom showed me today was so beautiful. You know, you can almost see, in fact, that the way Tom showed me the wood at the top it's so beautifully, if you could say almost purely done. You can't even feel ridges on it, but they're all little pieces together. You know, that tabernacle was fashioned there beautifully for your little chapel, and Mary was fashioned free of sin, no defects whatsoever in this woman in reference to sin, and that's how it began to be spoken of. And the last thing I'll say is, when the Catholic Church beatifies or canonizes a person, that's when they accept the writings of that person. The Catholic Church canonized Thomas Aquinas within 50 years of his death. So that his theology became prominent right away. They don't touch canonized Bonaventure for 208 years. So he was under wraps until a Franciscan Pope came along and canonized him. Okay, well, I kind of feel a little nepotism there, but he canonizes him, okay? Scotus doesn't get beatified until the end of I think 1989 or 90. He gets beatified. And that's now, officially, you can walk in those writings of Scotus today, if you will. So it's only not even 25 years that we're trying to use Scotus's writings, in addition to Bonaventure and some of the other members of our Franciscan intellectual tradition. Tom showed me your chapel. You had the bigwigs of the intellectual tradition in your stained glass windows there. Anthony and Bonaventure and Scotus, to name a few that I saw there. So it has a lot to do with our intellectual tradition and the beginnings of it. Did you see the movie Brother Sun, Sister Moon? Okay, that's kind of a little a poetical expression of Franco Zeffirelli, but there's a beautiful line in there. When the young men from Assisi are beginning to go down and join Francis. He was a San Damiano, and they're beginning to join him. And the leaders of the government are upset. We're losing the cream of our crop. The mayor complains to the bishop and says the church is curdling our milk. They're killing us. We can't fight a war anymore. All the men are going to join France. So he does affect society just by the fact that the young people left Assisi to join him, and a number of them did. And then later, when lay people want to follow him, and he sets up ultimately what we call today the secular Franciscan branch of the Franciscan order, for married people, single people, so forth. One of the first requirements was they were not to bear arms. So you can see what that was going to do to all the wars and the crusades of the church. He tried to stop the crusade at Damietta, tried to stop it, but the cardinal wouldn't listen. The Sultan listened to him, but the cardinal wouldn't. It's interesting. But he did shake the church. He did shake the church. And on that, maybe one last thing to say. One friar once said to me, and he taught us right here in Brooklyn on Remsen Street, Tony Carrozzo, when he was teaching there, he said, religious life is supposed to be the prophetic mantle for the Catholic Church. They're supposed to be wearing the prophetic mantle. And as soon as religious life becomes institutionalized, they lose the prophetic edge. In other words, to be countercultural, not just to be countercultural for the sake of being countercultural, but for addressing the system, and the system being the Catholic Church. And religious life is supposed to be that. So, for example, Francis never wanted us to be bishops. So you got Charlie Chaput right now down in Philadelphia as the Archbishop, who's a Capuchin Franciscan. You got Sean O'Malley up in Boston, who's a Cardinal and a Capuchin Franciscan. We have Franciscan bishops, so they've joined the institution. They've dropped the prophetic mantle, according to Francis.